Very good. I'm sure you've had a very interesting discussion. And before I invite questions from the floor, I have two questions myself. And the first one, I want the views of both speakers on what do we do when the wind doesn't blow?
You go first.
So, I live in Kinsale. I have great difficulty keeping a straight face when somebody asks me a question like that.
Yeah.
It is true that there are certain times when the wind doesn't blow. The reality is that the level of wind that we have in Ireland is highest in the wintertime, and it is lower in the summertime. And one of the reasons why solar energy is important is because it's higher in the summertime and lower in the wintertime. So they do complement each other very well. And it is true to say that, wind, whilst we have a huge resource, which is true, as we go forward in this transition, we will need lots of technologies. We will need wind, onshore and offshore. We will need solar. We will still need biomass. We still have hydro in Ireland, which we will continue to use. And hopefully, it's not commercial yet, but in due course, we would hope to have ocean energy coming on stream as well.
Yeah, very good. Brian, what are your views?
So first of all, wind is not the solution to everything, and it's one resource we should use, but as Mary said, there's plenty other we should use, and others are coming down in price. So in managing risk, diversity is always good, But today, if the wind doesn't blow, we use energy from other sources, which includes gas and coal. So some of the times we have to keep those stations as backup, which uses a little bit of energy, but much less than many people claim. It takes a couple of % of the energy just to keep something on standby. And if the wind dies down, you turn something else up. But while the wind is blowing, we're getting cheaper, cleaner electricity. When the wind not blowing, we revert to fossil fuels. In just a few years, storage will become more possible, so you can have big batteries, you can have small batteries in your home. Yeah. Mary also mentioned something that's really important about demand-side management, so the idea that there's already been trials of this, so it's already possible, where your washing machine is connected to the internet, and it can be told, if you want to use electricity now because the wind's not blowing, it's going to cost you twice as much. But if you're willing to wait until midnight, you can get it for cheaper, and the washing machine will make a decision. Yeah. And in fact, there was one trial in California where what the user had to do was basically say how mean or generous they were, how much they're willing to pay. So you had literally a little dial to say, I don't mind how expensive it is, I want to be able to run my washing machine whenever. Or you could say, I'm a bit parsimonious, so I'm happy to take the signal to do it during the night. So imagine if we all had those kind of technologies where we were actually talking to the system all the time about is now a good time to turn things on, and that. So the future is much more high tech, much more interactive like that.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Brian's last observation about storage signposts my next question, and I was just wondering, where are we right now in relation to storage, energy storage?
So at the moment, we have one form of energy storage that has been around for a long time, and that's what they call pumped hydro. Yeah. This is basically where we have a dam and we can pump the water up when energy is plentiful, and then use it come down. So that we have that, but of course it's a very small amount, certainly in the Irish context. But it's useful, and we should use it as best we can. Our main area of storage then after that comes, leaving aside the high-tech displacement issue, comes from two areas. One is compressed air, for example. One of the biggest compressed air storage projects in Europe is actually taking place just outside Belfast, the CASE compressed air study, using, for example, former empty salt caverns to store air, and then you can release it when you need it as a storage. It's a fairly large infrastructure investment, and it's quite expensive. And the other then is batteries. So you can have an array of batteries that will come into the electricity grid. The difficulty there is that batteries today are about 5 times more expensive than generation. Yeah. Now, of course, this is something that we do expect to change, just as I showed the technology cost reductions for wind and solar. Likewise, the technology costs for storage are declining. The most efficient form today is the lithium-ion battery. We have some difficulties with that, to be perfectly honest. We don't have any lithium in Ireland. We have very little lithium in Europe, and most of the batteries produced in the world come from Asia. So So I think there is a strategic issue to think about there going forward. What do we use as batteries? Where do we get the resource, the physical resource to make the batteries?
Yeah.
And where are they actually manufactured? Because without any doubt, if we go down the route of electrification of our transport, we will need to be able to produce the batteries much closer to home with a resource that is plentiful. So it is a solution, not today because it's very expensive, but of course in the longer term it's very likely to be.
That's very interesting. Brian?
Just one little addition. I think Mary's right on every point, absolutely. But we all in our homes today have a very significant storage facility. It adds up to the biggest in the country, and it's called the hot water tank. So we're storing a lot of energy in there when we heat it up. And I can tell, as you know, if you buy a water tank now, it's sealed with lots of insulation. If you can see copper, it's probably not as insulated as it should be. But imagine then, as you say, as Mary said earlier, turn that on in the middle of the night when the wind is blowing, there's no demand, heat it up, and it's so well insulated, it actually stays hot for 48 hours. So you can have control systems now that manage all that for you and basically guarantee you will always have hot water whenever you want it, but it's making decisions as to when to put the heat into the tank. So it's not as high tech as some of these things, but it's a very big resource.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'll take questions from the floor now.
How are we doing? Dave, Table 12. I've just got two questions. First one is, what would you think would be the impetus required for the government to actually take action on climate change, in the sense of actually bring in legislation or to actually put in wind farms or change energy policies and all that, aside from the old adage of vote in the ballot box, or what I mean. But if it's so important, we're being told it's important, we're telling them it's important, what do you think would be the actual impetus that would get them going? And then secondly, regarding cost, which is a word that's come up a lot in all the discussions, on a big scale, would you be able to put a price on, say, a large wind farm off the west coast, an offshore wind farm? And then for Brian, this house on Utopia Avenue that you speak of, would you be able to put an average price on all of those measures, energy efficient measures, if you were to get them done roughly at today's costs, at today's prices?
Yes.
If I could try maybe just on the first issue for government, I think as Brian said, the voice of people is the first issue, and I think that's the positive approach to take. I think there's also, of course, a carrot and stick approach. I mean, the stick approach is, of course, that we have legally binding targets in Ireland, for example, for renewable energies, and if we fail to meet those targets, we will pay very heavy fines. And just as an illustration, about 2 years ago, there was a big debate in the Dutch Parliament, and the Netherlands was in a similar situation to ourselves, and the proposal was made to the Dutch Parliament that instead of having wind onshore, offshore, that the Netherlands would buy, because you can do a statistical transfer, they would buy a statistical transfer from Romania or Bulgaria or whatever. And the parliamentarians reacted quite negatively and said, if we're going to spend money, we're going to spend it in the Netherlands. And from that, they developed a cross-party programme to roll out renewable energy in the Netherlands. Now, Ireland will face a similar question coming up to the 2020. We can buy renewable transfers from other countries in Europe, but why buy it when we could invest that money at home, jobs, development and growth at home for our own economy? I think there's a second issue, and that is that we are a country that economically relies quite a bit on foreign direct investments. And a lot of that is in, say, the pharma sector, the ICT sector, kind of the new industry sectors. And when you look at these companies, they declare themselves to be 100% renewable companies. That's their objective. They want to go down the route of being 100% renewable. And it becomes a negative for the country if we cannot deliver that for them. Probably not going to change their decision to invest, but it just makes it that little bit harder to persuade them to think about Ireland if we can't deliver on what it is they want as part of their corporate objective. But I think the biggest reason for it, and the biggest message to the government, is that this makes economic sense. It makes economic sense for Ireland, And more importantly, it makes economic sense for the citizens and the consumers in Ireland. Even if we were to pay the same amount of money for our own energy, wind farms, solar parks, whatever it might be, at least the money would circulate in our economy rather than in somebody else's. And we choose how much to charge for the energy rather than being at the receiving end of the global market of the price for oil or gas, as the case may be. So I think the message has to be that the population of Ireland wants this, and they expect the government to deliver it. And then, of course, there are many good reasons why that can be done.
Brian?
I think it is important to be clear, because I did say very clearly that this is perfectly possible, and it is, but it will cost a lot of money. A transition to low carbon economy will involve a lot of investment, and let's not deny that. But as Mary said, there's a lot of, if you just purely look at what's the cost of that unit of electricity or that unit of electricity, you're in danger of not seeing the hidden costs or the hidden benefits. You have to look at it much more widely. And again, the equation is kind of easier for us because we're such a heavy importer, that anything we do to reduce our dependence on those imported fossil fuels has extra benefits than it does for somebody who is using their own, if you like. On the specific questions, up till now, offshore wind tends to be about twice the price of onshore wind, but it's coming down, and there was some auctions recently in the UK that showed much lower prices for offshore wind than has ever been seen before, but we have to wait and see are they actually built, because the way these auctions work is people bid in and say, I can build a wind farm for X euros or pounds, and then they win the contract, if you like, and then we have to wait a couple of years to see if they build it. So prices are coming down, but up to now the difference is about a factor of 2. And on the house, again, if you're building a new house to that kind of standard, it'll add a bit to your cost, but not that much if you do it right, because you're starting with a blank slate. If you wanted to retrofit a typical average home to a really, really high standard, the kind of Utopia Avenue, which I'm going to use from now on, scale, you'd probably be talking about 30 or 40,000 euros. So it's not cheap. And obviously, if your energy bills are currently 2,000 euros and you get them down to 200, you're saving 1,800 euros a year. But that still means it's going to take you 25 years to pay off the capital. So let's not deny that that's a big barrier for people, that it's a big capital outlay to upgrade a home. But I do think there's a role for public money there, because again, it's not a question of will I or won't I do this. If I don't get the carbon out of the homes, am I going to get them out of the cows? Am I going to get them out of the cars? We know where are we going to make our choices, assuming we all agree that we need to get rid of carbon. And then the choice becomes not will I, won't I, but which of those options is cheapest, best, brings most other benefits, and I think that changes your thinking about the role of state investment in this as well.
Yeah, we'll move on to another table now. I know that there were other questions, but we'll move on to another table.
Good morning. I'm the facilitator for table number 14. Citizens have a couple of questions. I'll ask them individually to the panel. Firstly, the citizens were very curious and wanted more information as to why they're unable to sell back excess electricity back to the grid. They wanted to know who is preventing this, and has it ever been mooted as being an option? And they were curious as to whether or not the government feels pressure from private energy companies who have a vested interest in the grid to prevent individuals selling back to the grid.
So lots of countries do that right now. But it tends to be more expensive. So in Germany, an awful lot of roofs have solar panels on them, and you get a nice price for selling it back. But of course, everyone else pays for that in their bill. And that's a debate to be had. Are we willing to have slightly more expensive energy? And remember, there's a kind of a distributive effect here, because if you're rich enough to have solar panels, you put them on and you get well paid for them. If you're not rich enough to have solar panels, your electricity bill goes up to pay for those other people. So there are societal debates to be had here. So policy could happen. There's no reason why we couldn't do it. And there's a public consultation going on right now. If you look at the website of the Department of Climate Action and Environment, whatever their name is, there's currently a public consultation open on this exact issue. So you're welcome to make your input into that. And I think for me, that's the key equation. Are we willing to pay for that and take the consequences of it?
Am I allowed to
Oh, you are indeed, yes.
Just slightly. We normally agree on everything,
Yeah.
but on this point, I must say I do disagree. In terms of, we're talking now about individual, say, solar panels on your roof at home.
Yeah.
And you have access to what you actually consume yourself, and you want to sell it to the grid. Today, you can give it to the grid for free. And, you know, let me pick a figure, it's 20 euro cents a kilowatt hour for electricity in Ireland. And if you wanted to get a payback on your panels, let's say of 7 years, you'd have to get a subsidy of 25 or whatever the figure is. But I don't believe that's actually the issue. And this, the experience we've seen from other countries, and the one I would draw an analogy with is Portugal, where in Portugal you can put 4 panels on your roof. You need no requirement, no planning permission, no authorization, anything. You use as much as you can, and you sell to the grid, and you get the auction price for PV less 15%. So you're selling the electricity cheaper than anybody else. Because it is true to say smaller scale, it's a little bit more awkward, whatever. And so when Brian says this is something for rich people and not for poor, I vehemently disagree with this. As we go forward in the energy transition, we have to engage private money. I mean, public money can't afford to pay for that. We have to engage private money. And this is a way of allowing people who want to do it to spend their own money to do what they want to do and to contribute to the climate change. And if you structure what you get paid for the electricity that you supply, and it's less than everything else, well, then it's not an extra charge on people who don't do it. So I think that's a false argument to say it's only for the rich and not for the poor. But above and beyond that, there's an even more important element to this. This is a facilitation. It shouldn't be an obligation. You should just be allowed to do it if you want to do it. And by allowing people to do it, you open the energy system to participation by anybody who wants to be in it. And that's what the energy transition is all about. The energy transition that we're looking at is going from big, centralized coal-fired power stations, sending electricity down the system, and all you do is pay a bill. The new system that we're looking at is, it's ours. It's all of ours. We can produce it, we can use it, we can store it, and we can sell it. And we can sell it to our neighbours, and we can sell it to the village, or to the town, or down the street. That's the big change in the system that I'm aware of, and I've asked this question repeatedly of a number of people in the industry. There is no technical reason why there cannot be a tariff for individually supplied electricity to the grid. It's a question in the consultation at the moment, although the position in the consultation is, we don't think it's the right time. So I leave it to you as to what you might say about that.
So in the heel of the reel, it's an issue of policy. Yeah. I know you have other questions, and I'll come back to you if we have time, but I just want to give other tables an opportunity.
I am the facilitator for Table 1. The members of the table have 3 questions. First of all, what is the tax payable now on electric cars? Number 2, is there a grants incentive for builders to actually encourage homeowners to use the grants, or is there any advantage to builders to actually have a grant put in place and inform home builders about those grants? And thirdly, could Ireland go entirely onto wind energy even if we moved our fleet onto electric vehicles? Is there that capacity to switch entirely onto wind energy?
Do you want to go first? Okay. Well, starting.
Will you share them?
We'll share them out. So, for the builders, so I'm a little out of touch, but I'll try and answer this. I used to work for this agency that delivers grants, but not no more. So I don't speak for them formally. I guess the real incentive for the builder is the volume of work. You know, the retrofit sector 10 years ago was tiny, but now something like 300,000 homes have availed of those grants and got work done. So, but there probably is a risk. I've certainly heard of cases. One of the things that we always focused on in SEAI was we'd make sure the builders did good quality work, using good products. We wanted to protect the consumer, but of course that caused tension because sometimes homeowners would maybe not value that so much. So I've definitely heard of cases where a builder might say, listen, if you do it without the grant, I'll use a cheaper boiler and we'll do it cash in hand and that'll be worth more than the grant. Why don't we shake hands on it? So there's nothing, it's for the homeowner to decide whether they're going to settle for that or not, but then suddenly you have no guarantee of quality if something goes wrong. You have no idea what kind of boiler the guy is putting in, all that kind of thing. So I think we were trying to create an environment where people valued the quality and therefore worked within a system that guaranteed the quality, and it's ultimately for people to decide that. And if that is true, then the builders who are working in the grant environment and doing good work get more work. And we certainly saw some nice examples of companies emerging with really good solutions. They do your whole house for you. They do it in a really professional way. I once saw a case where, the guys arrive at the door, and if you had builders in, this isn't always true. The first thing they do is they take their boots and they put little plastic covers over the boots so they don't leave dust in your hall. And the last thing they do when they leave in the evening is they take out their hoover and they hoover every inch of your house, and they tell you they'll be back tomorrow to do some more or whatever else. So there are good people doing it, but it's ultimately up to the consumer to decide whether they're going to accept that or not. On the cars, if I remember correctly, for an electric car today, you don't pay VRT. You get a grant from SCAI, which is worth up to €5,000, and your motor tax is lower. So it's quite a good incentive. And if you're driving a lot, basically an electric vehicle costs more to buy but less to run. So the more you drive, the better the equation works out. So if you're a heavy commuter, if you're doing a long distance every day, it's now more or less break even with the grant that the electric vehicle won't cost you more. They're still a little bit more expensive, and it does rely on the subsidies, but they're getting cheaper. But I think that's about the amount that's available. And the electricity is free. I don't know if that'll always be true. So. Yeah. I'm sorry, the question about running on all wind. No, I don't think you can run a system on all wind without some technologies being deployed like demand side control and more storage than we have, and I don't think it would be right to run a system all on wind. Right now, we get about a quarter of our electricity from wind, and somebody asked me to put a scale on that. So in broad terms, there's about 2,000 wind turbines stuck in the ground in Ireland in various places, and that provides about a quarter of our electricity. If you wanted to get the same amount of electricity from solar, you'd have to put solar panels on about 1 million roofs. So that's the kind of scale we're talking about. But of course, we're just talking about electricity because a far bigger user of energy is heat and transport. Electricity is only about 1/5 of our system, so it's important that we don't only talk about electricity. Though, of course, the more we move to electric cars or heat pumps or things like that, the more we can move to making better use of our renewable electricity resources.
And if I may, just on the issue of all wind, as we go down the route of electric vehicles, which we apparently will do, solar becomes particularly relevant because, generally speaking, we would have a higher availability of solar electricity than our demand. So the ideal time to charge your electric vehicle is actually in the middle of the day using solar energy. And that's why, in terms of thinking ahead for the infrastructure, yes, it's good to have the charging point at home, and you can do it at night at 4 o'clock, as the case may be, but you should also have the charging points everywhere, in the supermarket, in the bank, in the library, in the hospital, readily available, so that during the day you go to work, you plug in your car, you charge it with solar power during the day.
Very good. I'll take, yes.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 7. I have 2 questions. This question I've asked of both panels yesterday. If you were in charge, what's the one change you would implement? And the second question is for Brian. You stated there that 25% of our energy is from wind energy. What percentage is Irish owned? And lastly, one of the citizens would just like me to say that she found both presentations very inspiring. Thank you.
And your second question. Are you talking, in your second question, are you asking who are the owners of the wind farms? Are they Irish? Is that the question?
That's correct, Judge, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on that. Yeah.
So if I had to do one change, one single change, make my home comfortable. That's the single change I would make. You know, for each of us, look at our own home and make it as comfortable and as energy efficient as possible. And then around that you can do lots of things, but that's something that we can all do. It's in our own interest, and you can deliver a huge benefit for climate change just by doing that one thing. On Irish-owned wind farms, I don't have figures in my head, and it's certainly true to say that wind farms, once they if you're going to invest in a wind farm, there are 5 stages of development. So you have the first stage, which is high-risk development, through to the operational stage. And frequently what happens is that the first 1 or 2 steps would be done locally, people who know the system, who understand the system, who have access to the land, who can manage the planning approvals, etc. But by the time you get to the operation, when it's actually running as a fully fledged wind farm, then it becomes a commercial asset. And for example, it's very attractive to pension funds because it's a long-term asset giving income through into the long term, so it matches their risk profile. So it is at that point that you would frequently find that the wind farm would perhaps change hands.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a figure on that, and so this is purely my own guesstimate, and my guesstimate is the vast majority is Irish owned, because we're a little bit unusual in Ireland that a lot of the developers are actually the state owned companies. So Bord na Móna are quite active, ESB, Bord Gas, they all own wind farms, and then there's some private Irish companies as well. So I can't be confident of the figure, but I think the underlying point about the question is this sense of feeling the money is going elsewhere and that it's not belonging to the community, and that's certainly clear, and I think it's really something we have to address. And I genuinely say that I think some wind companies need to improve their behaviour in terms of how they engage with local communities, and this sense of wanting local partners and sharing the money. And you'll hear one of the speakers in the next panel who's done some excellent work on this issue in Tipperary, so probe him on this issue as well, because it can be done, but it hasn't been normal practice, and it's unfortunate, because I go back to the point that we have this resource that's cheap and clean, and if companies mess up how they develop the sector, it'll do us all harm in the long run, because some of the concerns really need to be addressed. If I had to do one thing, and you said I was in charge, so I'm just going to speculate about that for a second. I think I'm glad I'm not. But when I worked in government here, it's a question of, you had so many government departments trying to deal with this, and you had to get agreement from everybody, then you had to get budget assigned, and then you had to compete with other priorities, and then you had to get a minister's attention, and then you had to, everything was complicated and messy and took a long time. And so, to answer your question, if I was in charge, I'd have a sign on my wall that said, make it happen. I'd probably put an exclamation point at the end of it just to emphasize it, and I would say, listen ministers, listen civil servants, listen agencies, I really want you to do this, just go and do it, because there's nothing like political priority and political enthusiasm to get things done. You can have all the rules in the world and all the climate laws in the world, but if politicians and ministers don't want to prioritise, it won't get done. If they do want to prioritise it, they don't need laws and rules, they can just get on with it. So really that kind of sense of seriousness, and again, that comes back to all of us, and if you don't mind, I just do a little test here, because I asked 1 or 2 tables this in our discussions. How many people, I don't count the observers because they're from NGOs and things like this, with a show of hands, how many people among the citizens have ever brought up climate change with their local TD, or mentioned it to them, or said to them, I'm more likely to vote for you if you take climate change more seriously? Show of hands. Well, I'm impressed that there's that many. Because when I talk to TDs, and I know this can be an excuse, whatever else, when I talk to TDs and even ministers, they say this never comes up, and people don't ask me about this, and they don't say to me, I want more action on this, and therefore they think it's not going to be among my priorities. And equally, I'm not willing to take risk on this. I'm not willing to do something that might prove unpopular because nobody is asking me to do it. So government leadership comes back to society wanting that. I don't think we as a society have ever asked our ministers or government or leaders that we want to be a leader in climate change. I don't think we've ever told them that.
Thank you very much, Brian. And Paul Kinney may mention Templederry wind farm in his. It's mentioned in his paper. I just mentioned that. I'll take the question from table 3 now, and I'll do that next.
Morning. I'm the facilitator for table 3. There's one question from the table. Are there 1 or 2 great examples from other EU cities or countries of schemes that helps decarbonise a society?
Yes, there are lots actually.
Yeah.
Let me give you perhaps one of the easier examples, and that is for Vienna. In Vienna, they had historically a military airbase fairly close to the centre, which they decided to close, and they used that as a modern investment location. They call it Lakeside, and there all the buildings are, of course, as you can imagine, to modern standards. It's self-sufficient in terms of energy. They have electric cars that you can put your card in, and you just shared electric vehicles. They have a university, they have offices, they have residential, and they have community centres there. And that's an illustration of where the government decided this is going to be our showcase. Then you have other ones where, for example, for Stockholm has taken a decision that they will be carbon-free by 2030. It's a big ask for the city to be carbon-free by 2030.
Carbon-free,
and that's their specific objective.
Yeah.
Individual cities have taken, Amsterdam, for example, has taken a decision to be the smart city.
Yeah.
And just one illustration, they are introducing what they call smart lampposts. So we talked about charging electric vehicles. So the lampposts, you've seen this. You've seen when you walk into a room, the lights come on. And of course, in a street, they've done the same logic. So that when people move, the lights stay on, but when there's nobody moving, the lights go off.
Yeah.
In the lamppost, it's a charging point. So you have charging points everywhere. And of course, they have LED light fittings, and they have solar-powered light coming through on the lamppost. So just as an illustration of some of the things that cities have done.
Yeah, thank you very much. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Just a small point, which is to say, let's look beyond Europe as well. And I travel quite a lot these days to lots of places that I used to travel to in Asia and other places, and you see so much going on in this area. And just to give you one figure, every hour of every day, somewhere in the world, 30,000 solar panels are put up. Like, it's a massive global movement now on things like solar, wind, insulation. All of these things are big global movements. People are still building coal power plants, and people are still doing things the old ways. Let's not deny that. But there's a lot of stuff happening in all parts of the world. In China, for instance, which is still a very inefficient country compared to us, they're doing massive amounts. They did so much on energy efficiency last year that they saved more energy than the total energy used by Germany through improvements in energy efficiency, because when China is so big, when it does something, it really makes a total difference. So this is a global conversation we're having, not just a European one.
Yes. I'll take a question from there. Now, we're running out of time, so...
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 4, and the citizens at this table would like to know what country most similar to Ireland is the most successful in achieving renewable energy targets? What are they doing that we're not doing? And the second question is, why, in your opinion, is the government so slow to implement green initiatives such as smart meters? And why are we so complacent about meeting green targets? Is it cost or lack of interest?
Mary.
Okay, so the comparators I would draw would be Portugal and Denmark. But let me take Denmark, because Denmark is a population about 5 million, so it's about the same as ourselves. It's not an island, but it's close to being an island, although they have certain advantages that we don't have. And they have come from a history of using fossil fuel coal and other things as well. And they have, as Brian said, they've declared they're going to be fossil free by 2050. I think the first thing that they've done is they've taken a national decision, cross-party agreement, that this is an objective. Secondly, they have taken it up as an industrial strategy. So just as we have food production, for example, as an industrial strategy in Ireland, in Denmark, it's an industrial strategy. So, for example, Vestas, it's one of the biggest manufacturers of wind turbines, especially offshore wind turbine. It's a Danish company. And I went to see the facilities there. They had to build a harbour long enough for the wind turbines, you know, the stem of them. And they converted a village harbour, which used to be used for fishing, which had effectively died, and revitalised it through the offshore wind by the manufacturer of the turbines there.
You'll be interested to know that we'll be hearing about Denmark at the next session, and Connie Hedegaard is coming to talk to us.
Excellent. Well, she will be able to explain to you that. So, I mean, it is in Denmark, they've done some things that are really very good, and I think, you know, we've talked about this again and again. In Denmark, it's a national activity. Everybody is involved, and community energy is normal in Denmark. So they have, you know, you can put up a wind farm. Normally, the community will either do it or be involved in it, but they can also choose not to be involved in it. So it's a choice, but the mechanisms are there for involving everybody in the process. So I think for me, that would be the greatest analogy for Ireland, is to look at Denmark, because it's about the same size and has a lot of characteristics that would be similar.
Brian?
Well, just to add that I think it's important that this isn't just about saying let's make a national statement tomorrow. We want to go carbon free. It's the work. Denmark's been working on this for 40 years, so we can't just say we want to be carbon free and assume somebody's going to make it happen and we don't have to do anything. It involves all of us being involved, spending money, changing our behaviours, voting for people who support that, all of these things, and including making the hard decisions. You know, we can't say, well, I'm in favour of carbon free, but I don't think you should tax what I like to use, or I'm in favour of carbon free, but I don't think you should build that in my neighbourhood. You know, that, you know, it actually has to follow through to the real changes, because let's not underestimate, it's a very big project. We're like, you can hear that we're enthusiasts for this project, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that all we do is make a public declaration and it happens by itself. It involves a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of work on everybody's part. So it's going to take a lot of social commitment if we want to take up that leadership position.
But just to reformulate the second question, why haven't we got further in the task by now?
Can I give Ireland a little bit of credit, because Mary did as well? Like the progress we have made on energy efficiency is very strong. Like, we've upgraded a lot of homes, albeit they're not deep retrofits, but we have made some good progress. Our new homes are very efficient. Our industry has made a lot of efficiency gains in the last few years. We've made progress on wind energy, but not on solar, which I think we need to. So there are some glimpses of what we can achieve if we do an awful lot more. But I think the answer is back to the same thing. Why haven't we done more? Because we haven't wanted to. And I mean that as a society. I don't think we can just say it's the politicians' fault. You know, it's up to us all as a society to decide whether we want to do this or not.
Mary?
I think, again, in fairness, you know, when this whole thing, you know, about renewable energy kind of really kicked off back in 2005, 2009, so on and so forth, Ireland was very much to the fore and was, you know, a front runner. We have to accept that, you know, with a small little occurrence called a financial crisis that hit Ireland fairly badly, and money was very tight. Money for anything was very tight. Certainly public money was very tight, private money was very tight, and I suppose there was a sense of, well, we can do it, but just not today. We'll do it tomorrow. Okay. And so that possibly explains why we have a little bit of a hole in our policies. It was great up to about 2010, and then it kind of wasn't much, and we're starting back again now. So unfortunately now we have to play a little bit of catch up because of that, and the catch up doesn't necessarily cost us more. It's true that others have been doing it and that has brought down the technology costs so we can benefit from it, but we have a journey to make and it will take a serious commitment.
Well, we've had a very interesting, I'd love to take more questions and I'd love to hear more answers, but it's we're 5 minutes over our time, and I'm going to bring it to an end now, and I'm really, really grateful to both of our speakers, and I want you to show your appreciation for them, because I know you do appreciate it.